Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister has complained that voting for anybody but the Liberals in Wentworth will destabilise his government. But didn't this Prime Minister destabilise the government in the first place when he and his colleagues deposed Mr Turnbull? Isn't government instability the only reason we are having the Wentworth by-election? And will the Prime Minister explain to the people of Wentworth why Malcolm Turnbull is no longer the Prime Minister of Australia?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I know who the Australian people don't want to be Prime Minister, the Leader of the Labor Party, Mr Speaker. They don't want him, and they've had 5 years to have a good look at him, Mr Speaker, and they've rendered their verdict on him, Mr Speaker, when they make their judgment about who they think should be the Prime Minister of this country, who they think should be managing the economy of this country, who should be looking out for Australian families about their costs of living, who they can trust to get taxes down, Mr Speaker. That's what the Australian people are making their judgments about, Mr Speaker. They have made their judgment on this Leader of the Opposition, and they know after 5 years of looking at him hard and looking at everything he's said, on every flip-flop he's ever made, he's for small business, he's against small business, he's for small business, he's against small business, and he wonders why the Australian people don't trust him and why small businesses in particular don't trust him. I'll tell you why we're cutting taxes for small businesses, Mr Speaker, because those on this side of the House know that small and family businesses are the backbone of our economy. That's why we do it. We believe in it. We don't have to be dragged into it. We initiate it. We bring the bills into this parliament and we say Australians deserve to keep more of what they earn. Our government is committed to a strong economy that guarantees the essential services that Australians rely on, that keeps Australians safe and brings and keeps Australians together. And in this Wentworth by-election, what I know people in Wentworth will be considering is how do you keep the economy strong? How can you ensure that you have the certainty in this parliament to ensure that the policies that are going to continue to grow our economy can be passed and can be pursued, because they can't trust on the Labor Party to do it, Mr Speaker. And as a majority party in this parliament, a majority coalition, the Liberals together with the Nationals, bringing forward policies week after week that are driving our economy forward, we need to continue to do that as a majority government in this parliament. And a vote for anyone other than Dave Sharma, the Liberal candidate in Wentworth, is a vote that would undermine that certainty and would undermine the strong economy that our government is delivering.
The member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister outline to the House how the government's actions to keep our economy strong are working to keep Australia together, keep Australians safe and deliver the services that Australians expect? Prime Minister, what are the risks and what is at stake if this commitment is not adhered to in the future?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, I thank the member for Robertson for her question, and it was great to be up on the Central Coast. A shout out to the project Central Coast. It was great to be at the Central Coast last week. It was great to be up there with Nathan from Zest, a small business owner, and of course Ryan and Chris, who run the Six Strings Brewing Company up there on the Central Coast, because they are two of many small businesses on the Central Coast who are ensuring a strong economy on the Central Coast to support jobs on the Central Coast so people can get about their livelihood and live and work and play in the region that they love, like so many people across this country want to choose to do. We're living up to our beliefs and we're living up to our principles when it comes to how we run our economic policies. We believe you need to back in Australians who are having a go, and that in particular means small and family businesses. And our policies have seen over the last 5 years more than 1 million Australians get a job. It's seen more than 100,000 young Australians get a job. In the last year alone, that is the highest rate of employment growth for young people on record. That's more than 100,000 young people whose lives have been changed as a result of them getting a job. And what are those beliefs? And what do those principles mean? It means we believe in lower taxes. We believe in lower taxes for small and family businesses. We believe in lower taxes for those who go out and earn a living as wage earners. We believe in lower taxes for those who have retired and are living off their retirement savings and not hitting them with higher taxes. We believe in those who want to invest in their future, that they shouldn't have higher taxes. We believe in lower taxes so Australians can keep more of what they have earned to provide for their plans for their future. We're investing in infrastructure, $75 billion in rolling infrastructure projects. I was just over the Northlink project in Western Australia a few weeks ago and seeing the massive progress being done. We're expanding our markets with trade deals to ensure that our businesses, large and small, can expand their businesses into growing markets all around our region and all around our world. We're transitioning our industries through things like our defence industry plan. Which is ensuring through the supply chain that companies that once were making vehicles are now making tank bonnets for armoured vehicles, like Penguin Composites down in Tasmania in the electorate of Braddon. And then we have, Mr Speaker, our medical industry plan, which is ensuring we're investing in future jobs in our fast-growing medical industry. And one thing we're also doing, Mr Speaker, is we're keeping militant unions out of the building and construction industry, which if the Labor Party were elected, you wouldn't pay more tax, you would pay more tax. You'd pay more tax, you'd pay more for your private health insurance, you'd pay more for your electricity bills, and you'd pay more for what you're doing in building and construction because of Labor.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. This morning, when asked about laws which allow discrimination against LGBTI teachers, the Treasurer said, and I quote, "I don't think these laws are right. And I do think we need to ensure that there is no discrimination on either our workplaces or our schools." Does the Prime Minister agree with his Treasurer? And will the Prime Minister join with Labor to ensure that teachers can't be sacked because of who they are or who they love?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I'm happy to table the letter that I sent to the Leader of the Opposition today. And I table that letter knowing that I believe it's very important that we act in this parliament over the next fortnight to deal with the unnecessary anxiety that has been created for children and their parents in relation to potential discrimination and expulsion of students on the basis of their sexuality. And we think that needs to be addressed, and we think it needs to be addressed urgently. And I've written to the opposition leader in those terms, and I have said that there are many other issues that will be addressed as a result of the Religious Freedoms Review that has been undertaken, and there will be a time and a place to address those issues. And they're important issues, but the issues that we need to address right here and now relate to the children and ensuring that we protect them against discrimination and that we act in the area of absolute consensus, not just in this place, but beyond this place. Because I know religious communities and schools also believe that they should not be, and indeed they do not, discriminate against children on the basis of their sexuality in their schools.
The Prime Minister resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
On direct relevance, on this policy issue, the question only went to teachers. It did not go to students at all. There is agreement on the issue of students, but this question is about the principles as they apply to teachers.
I thank the Manager of Opposition Business. I was listening very carefully. The Prime Minister just about 30 seconds ago addressed the topic of the question in the context of his answer. He's in order. I'm going to keep listening. The Prime Minister's in order.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, because as I indeed said, the Religious Freedom Report prepared by Philip Ruddock addresses a broad range of issues, including the ones that have been raised by the Leader of the Opposition. But what I have asked the Leader of the Opposition to do is to come together with the government this week and deal with the issue which, beyond this place and within this place, there is broad consensus. We are prepared to do that in absolute good faith. The Attorney-General is preparing amendments to those end and will share those with the Shadow Attorney-General, and I hope we're able to do that and that we won't be point-scoring and playing politics with this. We can just get it done and we can give those families and their children the certainty that they deserve, and that the laws which were indeed introduced by those opposite when they were in government can be corrected.
The member for Dawson.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister update the House on how strong economic management allows this government to invest in regional Australia and help make our roads safer and boost productivity? What are the risks and what is at stake if our plan to invest in regional roads and productivity is not delivered?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'm delighted to take this question from the member for Dawson, a very hard-working Queenslander, somebody who understands that when the regions are strong, so too is our nation. He's getting on with the job of lobbying and agitating for the roads that he wants in his electorate, and he's doing a darn fine job there too. And we know on this side of the House that good economic management helps to small businesses grow. Those great employers, those wonderful businesses who get behind our nation, who get behind our regions, particularly in the member for Dawson's electorate. And good economic management helps create jobs, a million jobs created in the first 5 years of our government, Mr Speaker. And good economic management enables us to invest in the roads and the infrastructure that regional Australia wants, needs, demands and, best of all and most of all, deserves. That's what exactly this government is doing. At the weekend I announced the guidelines in Manjimup in Western Australia for the Roads of Strategic Importance initiative. It's a $3.5 billion investment in making country roads safer. And whether it's that first mile or that last mile or all those in between, it's going to make sure that our freight task, which is expected to double up to 2030, those needs are addressed. It's an investment to boost productivity, as the member for Dawson full well knows, to get people home sooner and safer, to help get the mining wealth, the food and fibre to our ports, to our markets. We're growing our markets. The Trade Minister, his Assistant Minister are doing an outstanding job in that regard. It also has a specific $1.5 billion investment in Northern Australia, making sure that the North continues its critical role in boosting the productivity of our nation. And it follows our $10 billion investment in that marvellous 1,679-kilometre road, the Bruce Highway, finally ending the talk and delivering the highway that Queenslanders, indeed all the nation, needs. Mr Speaker, $800 million in the Cooroy to Curra section. I know how important that is for the member for Wide Bay. It's delivering the Mackay Ring Road Stage 1 and the Horton River Bridge upgrade projects, totalling more than $1 billion. I spoke to Lynn McLaughlin, the mayor up there the other day, just last week when I was with the member for Dawson. She knows how important that is. She also, and as does the member for Dawson, about the Bowen Road Bridge, a $3.3 million investment from the federal government at Townsville. Now, the member for Dawson and the coalition government, the Liberals and Nationals, understand that all this will go to waste if those opposite ever get into government. The Building Better Regions, the Roads of Strategic Importance, the Beef Road Initiative, they'll all go to waste. They'll all be dropped and stopped if ever those get into government. Woe betide if ever that happens.
The Deputy Prime Minister's time has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. I ask the Prime Minister again. Will the Prime Minister join with Labor to ensure that teachers can't be sacked just because of who they are or who they love?
Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Let me read to you the explanatory memorandum to the Labor's bill circulated by the then Attorney-General, Mark Dreyfus, in March 2013. The bill will extend the exemption at Section 38 of the Sexual Discrimination Act so that otherwise discriminatory conduct on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity will not be prohibited for educational institutions established for religious purpose. Consequently, the bill will not alter the right to freedom of thought, and it goes on, Mr Speaker. And he says in his second reading speech, the bill also amends existing exemptions as appropriate to reflect the new grounds. This includes exemptions for religious bodies in relation to employment and the provision of education that have been in place for many years, Mr Speaker. I said in answer to my earlier question that the issues raised will be addressed through the process of our response to the Ruddock review, and this fortnight I have asked to work together with the Leader of the Opposition to provide the certainty for children and families. Mr Speaker, I would say to the Leader of the Opposition, and I would say to those members opposite, that we don't take kindly to being lectured on these issues when you created the laws which created the discrimination.
Prime Minister concluded his answer. Prime Minister's concluded his answer. The Manager of Opposition Business.
I'd ask the Prime Minister to table a copy of the Ruddock report that he referred to in his answer.
The Prime Minister. The Prime Minister, as the Manager of Opposition Business well knows, did not quote from it. He merely referred to it. The point of order doesn't allow members to ask for documents to be tabled just merely because they've been referred to. The member, if the Leader of the Opposition, the Prime Minister, would just pause. The member for Indi is seeking the call. The member for Indi has the call.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, my electorate of Indi expects our government to show compassion, mercy and justice. And there have been claims and counterclaims about the welfare of children in immigration detention on Nauru, reports of children withdrawing, refusing to eat and unable to communicate. We have responsibility for welfare of these children. We put them there. Prime Minister, what would it take to act with compassion, mercy and justice to accept the resettlement offer from New Zealand and have these children and their families off Nauru by Christmas?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I thank the member for Indi for her question. My electorate expects our government to show compassion, mercy and justice. I believe every electorate, every constituency in this country expects that. And I must say, as both a shadow minister who had responsible for immigration and border protection, while I watched the carnage, Mr Speaker, that happened under the previous government as people died, as immigration detention centres were opened, that we closed, Mr Speaker. They expected us as a government to act with compassion, Mr Speaker, and we did. And we stopped the boats, Mr Speaker. That's what we did. And now we are dealing with the legacy of Labor's failure. And, Mr Speaker, I notice they get very agitated when I talk about this issue, and that's what happens when you stare failure in the face, which is your record on immigration and border protection as an opposition today and when you're in government. But to the very serious issues that the member for Indi asks about, there are 65 health professionals contracted by the Australian government to provide health services on Nauru, and that includes 33 mental health professionals. There is one healthcare professional to every 11 transferees on Nauru. Decisions about medical transfers are made on a case-by-cases, and quite a number of those have been made in recent times, Mr Speaker. 418 people have been resettled from Manus and Nauru to the United States, and I should note that, as you would also know, as we've discussed, transferees are not— I will come to the issue you've raised. But transferees are not in detention in Nauru. They are living freely in the community, as Nauruans are. Mr Speaker. But you ask about the question with New Zealand. Now, the advice I have from our agencies, and I've seen that advice and I've quizzed our officials on this advice, is that the advice of the government is that people smugglers are marketing New Zealand as a destination, as a backdoor to Australia. And you ask me what would need to happen. Well, Mr Speaker, we've introduced legislation into this place to prevent that backdoor movement of people from New Zealand into Australia. That legislation is not supported by those opposite, Mr Speaker, and we would ask them to consider that. The legislation has been sitting on the Senate notice paper up in the other place since 2016. It passed this chamber. It did not pass this chamber with the support of the Labor Party or the crossbench. But until that back door is shut, Mr Speaker, these issues only run the risk of inviting more people to risk their lives at sea and having to stop the boats. We're not going to start them again. Only the Labor Party will do that.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. Just before I call the member for Brisbane, I inform the House that joining us in the gallery this afternoon is Mr Marcelino Gonzalez, the first Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Cuba. He is also accompanied by His Excellency Mr Jose Gallego, Ambassador of Cuba. On behalf of the House, I extend a very warm welcome to you. I also inform the House that joining us in the gallery this afternoon is the Honourable Selina Ubao, Northern Territory Minister for Education and Workforce Training. On behalf of the House, I extend a warm welcome to you as well, and I call the member for Brisbane.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer outline to the House how our government is delivering strong economic growth for all Australians, including in my electorate of Brisbane? What are the risks and what's at stake if our plan to lower taxes, particularly for small and family businesses, is not observed?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Brisbane for his question, knowing that he has supported our efforts to provide legislated tax relief for 32,000 small and medium-sized businesses in his electorate, Mr Speaker. That is a result of our policy, Mr Speaker. Now, he knows, and the people of Brisbane know, that our economic plan is working. An economic plan that has created more than 1 million new jobs, around 1,000 jobs a day, Mr Speaker. An economic plan that has delivered economic growth at 3.4% through the year, at the fastest rate since the height of the mining boom, and higher than any G7 country, Mr Speaker. An economic plan that has delivered the smallest budget deficit in a decade and put us on track to come back to balance a year earlier in 2019-2020. And an economic plan that has seen Australia rewarded with a AAA credit rating from the 3 leading agencies, Mr Speaker. Now, on the weekend, I was in Indonesia for a meeting of G20 treasurers and the IMF and the World Bank. And Australia was lauded for its economic performance. The Secretary-General of the OECD praised Australia's strong economic growth and our sound macroeconomic policies, Mr Speaker. Now, we're not complacent. We know the Australian economy doesn't run on autopilot, and that the biggest threat to the Australian economy comes from those who are sitting opposite, Mr Speaker, because they have $200 billion of new taxes. Taxes on your income, taxes on your savings, taxes on your property, taxes on your business, higher taxes on your electricity, Mr Speaker. But most punishing of all is the retirees' tax, Mr Speaker, because not only is it bad economic policy, it's philosophically flawed, Mr Speaker, punishing those who take responsibility for their own retirement. It is going to impact on 900,000 individuals, Mr Speaker, 200,000 self-managed super funds, 2,000 super funds, Mr Speaker, and the perverse income is we'll see less people invest in Australian stocks, in Australian companies. It will see more people go on the pension, Mr Speaker. And, of course, it will see higher income earners rewarded with their franking credits, but not low-income earners, Mr Speaker. So only the Coalition will continue to grow the economy, only the Coalition will continue to deliver jobs, and the Labor Party will continue to increase everyone's taxes. That's right.
The member for Isaacs.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Given members of the Prime Minister's government are already leaking large parts of the secret Ruddock Review into religious freedoms, which the government has had for 5 months, why won't the Prime Minister just release it in full and announce the government's response so the Australian people, including voters in Wentworth, can read the whole report and know what the government is planning to do? What is the Prime Minister hiding?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Speaker, well, the answer to the question is nothing, Mr Speaker, nothing. As I said, the Ruddock review will be released with the government's response. And I think that is the appropriate way for the full report and the response to be considered together, so Australians can have a very clear understanding about what is being proposed. And the government has been addressing, particularly over the last 7 weeks, a range of other priorities, which have included addressing the drought, the Royal Commission into aged care, ensuring that we brought forward cuts in taxes for small and family businesses. On the weekend, we announced $51.8 million extra for headspace. We've announced another 30 MRI and other licences to ensure that those hospitals can have and be providing the services and support to Australians. So we've been very focused on these priorities, it is true. And over that period of time, Mr Speaker, as Prime Minister, I first saw this report not long after I became Prime Minister, and these other matters which I've identified to the House have been my priorities. And once we've been able to address those priorities, we'll be taking a government response through the normal cabinet process. And when we have concluded that, we will release this report and seek to have a mature discussion with this chamber and the other chamber and the Australian people about protecting the religious freedoms of which millions of Australians hold dear. We won't be bullied in it by the Labor Party. We would just simply hope, Mr Speaker, because I'm quite sure that their constituents would also want to address this very important issue of religious freedom in a sober and mature way, Mr Speaker, not trying to play politics and point score on it this fortnight.
The member for Latrobe.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Jobs, Industrial Relations and Women. Will the minister update the House on how the government is delivering for small and family businesses? What are the risks and what is at stake for small businesses from a different approach?
The Minister for Jobs, Industrial Relations and Women.
I thank the member for Latrobe for his question, and I want to congratulate him on the incredible work he's doing on behalf of the more than 16,000 small businesses in his electorate of Latrobe. And I had the great privilege of being able to be with him only last week to meet a very entrepreneurial young couple, Sophie and her husband David, who set about creating their own business, the Five Sparrows Cafe in Berwick. This is a business that they have had to sacrifice for, borrow money for, and of course work incredibly hard for, creating their own opportunity, their own employment opportunity, and an employment opportunity for around 16 other fellow Australians. And that's not to mention all of the small and medium-sized businesses that in fact supply their business. Sophie and David's story is the story of so many entrepreneurial Australians, and on this side of the chamber we are proud to be able to back small, medium and family-sized enterprises right across our nation, because we know that they play a critical role not only in providing the goods and services that their communities want and expect, but because they also provide the millions of jobs that Australians rely on, more than 7 million jobs at last count. And we're proud to be able to bring forward a tax cut for those small and medium-sized and family enterprises that will apply to around 3 million businesses because of our strong economic plan and our long-standing commitment to lower taxes on this side of the chamber, because we know that these businesses, these small and medium-sized enterprises, they are the engine room of the economy and they are the creators of employment. And they can continue to create jobs when they have certainty and they can continue to keep their costs down. But of course, those opposite have got a very different plan. They would see small and family-sized enterprises around the country face more of what they absolutely do not like, which is higher bills. They'd be slugged with higher electricity bills. They'd be stuck with footing the bill for union sweetheart deals, for the damage that militant unions would cause to productivity right across the country, sending industrial relations back to the dark ages. And, Mr Speaker, make no mistake that under Labor they will face higher electricity bills, because all we will see from those opposite are higher bills, bills that drain motivation, bills that sap productivity and bills that have a nasty habit of blowing a hole in the budget.
Members on my left, the member for McEwen, the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Last time the parliament sat, the Prime Minister guaranteed that all school funding deals would be agreed with the states by the 4th of October, the date of the scheduled COAG meeting which the Prime Minister cancelled. Is the reason that not a single state has signed a school funding deal for next year because this Prime Minister refuses to reverse his $14 billion cut to public schools?
The Prime Minister has the call.
No.
The member for Dunkley.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Member for
My
Dunkley has the
question
call.
is to the Minister for Defence Industry, representing the Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment. Will the Minister update the House on how the government's ambitious trade agenda is supporting Australian exporters? What are the risks and what is at stake for Australian exporters if this partnership is not honoured?
The Minister for Defence Industry.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Dunkley for his question because, like everyone on this side of the chamber, another strong advocate, a passionate advocate for the benefits that flow to Australia's small and medium enterprises as a consequence of the most ambitious trade agenda in Australia's history. And the Liberal and National Government have a strong track record of delivering market-opening trade deals for Australia's small and medium-sized enterprises, Mr Speaker. We did it under Minister Robb, we did it under my ministership, and we're doing it now under Senator Simon Birmingham. All of this geared towards making sure that we open up market export opportunities for Australian small to medium-sized enterprises because we know that that's critical for driving economic growth and for driving jobs. And the contrast between the record of delivery of the coalition, opening up export market deals in China, Japan, Korea, Singapore, the work that we've done now to conclude Indonesia, the work we've done with Peru, the new opportunities that will be opening shortly with the European Union and with the UK, all of this centred around making sure that the primary goal of this government of driving a strong Australian economy and creating jobs for Australians is delivered upon. And we will continue to do that, Mr Speaker. We'll continue to do it because we know that in order to keep the Australian economy strong, in order to ensure that Australians have the best chance of getting a job, in order to make sure that there is more opportunity for Australian businesses to go out there and to employ more Australians, we must open these market opportunities for Australian SMEs. And our track record, as I said, is very strong. But I want to put some contrast, though, because one of the biggest deals that this government's been able to put in place was, of course, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the TPP-11. And we pursued that when the Australian Labor Party said it was a vanity project and that the Liberal National Government should walk away. Because this is the problem with Labor. Labor's policy approach when it comes to trade is to get the big trade calls wrong. They get them wrong consistently. We saw it on the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement, and we see it now on the TPP-11. The fact is, Mr Speaker, the Australian Labor Party is very divided when it comes to trade policy. Half of the Australian Labor Party claims that they're acting in the interests of Australian workers and turning their back on Australian small to medium-sized enterprises. And there are other businesses who are actually recognising that for us to do this deal, we've got to have the Australian Labor Party on board. So we need the Australian Labor Party to stay firm, to hold the course, to remain on the side of Australian small businesses so that they can have certainty that Labor will not squib it when it comes to the trade deals.
The member for Macquarie.
Thank you, Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister has finally admitted that he was wrong to cut funding from Catholic and independent schools. Why won't the Prime Minister also admit he was wrong to cut $14 billion from public schools? Why won't the Prime Minister join with Labor to reverse his cuts to public schools so that every child can get the best start in life, no matter which school they go to?
The Minister for Education. The Minister has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. And I'd like to thank the member for her question because it gives me the opportunity to let the House know the government is providing record levels of funding to schools and it's growing every year. Commonwealth funding for state schools was $6.8 billion last year. It will be $7.3 billion this year. It will be $7.9 billion next year and $8.6 billion the year after that. From 2017 to 2027, Commonwealth funding to state schools will grow by 86%. According to the Productivity Commission, since 2006, on a per-student basis, Commonwealth funding to state schools has increased by 78.5%.
78%. The member for Barker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. What further action has the government taken to support farmers and regional communities and businesses in the grip of drought? And Prime Minister, what are the risks and what is at stake if the government cannot support our entire country because of a slowing economy or poor budget management?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Barker for his question. I was pleased to be out with Murray Bridge with him just on the weekend, visiting with a wonderful small family business producing tomatoes with hydroponics and a huge investment that Axon has been making in their future and for their family's future. And we're all about small family businesses, and so to be able to back them in with lower taxes and the instant asset write-off and all of the other taxation-based support that enables that those businesses can get in and make those businesses their investments to provide for their future and employ Australians, Mr Speaker, I think is a tremendous credit to them. Now, the National Drought Summit will of course be held on the 26th of October. It will be bringing together people from all around the country to ensure that we better coordinate the effort, including the Special Envoy, including the ministers, Mr Speaker, to ensure that we are properly coordinating our response, including with the situation update and program update that will be provided by Major General Stephen Day, who is the Drought Coordinator General. Now, the government has already provided $1.8 billion in additional support to drought-affected farmers and communities, and that importantly includes the announcement that we made, which gives $1 million to every single drought-affected council and shire across the country, which is ensuring that those towns are able to work their way through the drought, Mr Speaker. And I hear the heckles of those opposite. I don't know why they're opposed to us supporting councils with additional funds so they can employ people locally and keep the money in the towns. But that's our policy, Mr Speaker. But I'm also asked about other things we're doing to support, Mr Speaker, the work that is being done by farmers to get the fruit off the vine. The fruit off the vine as we go into the harvest season. And we've said there's three things we're going to do. First of all, we want the agricultural producers to log their job requirements, Mr Speaker, with the official service which registers this, Mr Speaker, which is, of course, the National Harvest Labour Information Service, 1800 062 332, and you can do it online as well. We need to know where the jobs are, when they start, how much they pay, Mr Speaker, so we can get Australians into those jobs, and if Australians won't do those jobs, they'll be in breach of their social security requirements. Australians should be not collecting the dole when there is work available for them on farms in Australia, Mr Speaker. And where there are shortages, we will make sure that the Pacific Labour Scheme and the seasonal worker program with our Pacific Island partners fills the gap, and on top of that, for the next harvest, the backpacker visa arrangements will be modified, Mr Speaker, to ensure we can fill that gap. We have a plan to ensure we get the fruit off the vine during the harvest plan, Mr Speaker. The Labor Party wants people to turn up, pick up the dole, even when they don't have to work and there's work available.
The member for Moreton.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister agree with the member for Bowman that his government is, and I quote, yet to provide a compelling alternative, end quote, to Labor's plan to invest $14 billion in public schools, a policy that would mean every child can get the best start in life?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As the Minister for Education just explained, we're investing almost $30 billion extra in education in state schools. We're investing, Mr Speaker, in non-state schools, in independent schools, in Catholic schools. We are investing at record levels in education in schools all around the country because we're running a strong economy and we're running a strong budget, Mr Speaker. The Labor Party can make all the pie-in-the-sky promises they like, but the Australian people know that they can't trust this leader of the Labor Party to run a budget or run the economy. And if you can't run an economy and if you can't run a budget, which the Labor Party showed last time when they were in office, then you can't keep your promises when it comes to funding schools, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, our government will continue to provide parents with the choice that they deserve, students with the education, Mr Speaker, that they deserve, and we will continue to fund all schools at record levels. And the Labor Party will continue to lie about these things. We'll continue to fund these things.
The member for North Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence. Will the Minister update the House on how the government is ensuring Australia's national security by increasing defence spending to 2% of gross domestic product? What are the risks and what is at stake for Australia's national security if this program isn't delivered in full?
The Minister for Defence.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for North Sydney for his question. I believe today might be his 50th birthday, so congratulations to the member for North Sydney, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, it is critically important that we fund the government's build-up of our military capability in full and into the future. Several years ago, we made the decision, Mr Speaker, that we would fund a build-up of our military capability, the largest in our peacetime history, costing from this year $200 billion over the next 10 years, and taking the spending on defence to 2% of gross domestic product by 2020, a year earlier than we had initially promised, Mr Speaker. That's why we put in place the structure to give people certainty, whether it's foreign governments, state and territory governments, the defence industry, the Australian government through the ADF and the Department of Defence. We set in place the structure through a white paper, through the Integrated Investment Plan, the Naval Shipbuilding Plan, the Defence Export Strategy, the Defence Industrial Capability Plan, so that everyone knows how we are building up our military by $200 billion over the next 10 years, giving us the security we need to be a good ally to the United States, to have the capability to influence our region, to be the regional security power in terms of submarines, for example, to have the regionally superior submarines, and we decided to use it as well to drive high-technology jobs, manufacturing jobs throughout our economy, and it is working, Mr Speaker. It's working very well. But we can only do it because we have budgetary management under control, under the Treasurer, and before him the Prime Minister, because we have a growing economy that gives us the financial capability, the heft, to invest that $200 billion to reach 2% of GDP. And it was a very, very different story, Mr Speaker, under the previous Labor government. In the previous Labor government, Mr Speaker, from 2007 to 2013, the Labor Party used defence as a piggy bank to take money from defence and to use it for other priorities in the government. And you know that spending under Labor on defence dropped to the lowest levels since 1938, the last year of appeasement before the Second World War, Mr Speaker. 1.56% of GDP in comparison to the 2% that we'll be spending by 2020. But we can do it because we have a growing economy, because we have strong budgetary management, and because we have a plan to deliver that military capability and the jobs that it entails.
The member for McMahon.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer.
Earlier this month, the Minister for Education claimed, and I quote, "The government has guaranteed preschool funding." But page 32 of budget paper number 3 shows there is no funding for preschools after next year. Will the Treasurer guarantee 4 years of funding for preschool for every 4-year-old in this year's mid-year financial update?
The Treasurer has the call.
A bit like when you got up at this dispatch box, the member for Lillian said, "I guarantee 4 years of surpluses tonight, Mr Speaker." I remember that. Now the answer is, you know that we have guaranteed funding to 2019. You know that. You know that. Early childhood.
The member for Kingston.
And you also know that we continue to have a discussion with the states and territories, Mr Speaker. Now you also know that when the Leader of the Opposition got up and announced his early childhood spending proposals, he was expecting the states to do all the heavy lifting, Mr Speaker, but he hadn't even got their agreement, Mr Speaker. Didn't even ask them, Mr Speaker. Now, one thing I can confirm to this House is when we put more money into schools, when we put more money into our universities, into our early childhood, when we put more money into the pockets of Australians, we fund it, Mr Speaker. We fund it because we have improved the health of the budget. We inherited growth in spending going at about 4% per annum. We have halved it to the lowest level in 50 years, Mr Speaker. We inherited $210 billion worth of debt, Mr Speaker. We are bringing the budget back into balance, Mr Speaker. Only we will deliver better education outcomes.
The member for Petrie.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the Minister please update the House on steps the government is taking to protect Australian families from transnational and organised crime? What are the risks and what is at stake if our approach to transnational crime is diluted?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for Petrie for his question. Like all Australians, he and all of us in this place are worried about the cost of transnational crime. We're worried that that figure is now estimated at $47 billion. So the sorts of things that we're talking about, Mr Speaker, is when our parents or senior Australians might go online and they might have their savings ripped off. They might be exposed to some sort of a syndicate that is targeting vulnerable people. It might give over passwords or bank account details. Mr Speaker, we are worried about the exploitation of children, particularly in relation to Australians moving offshore or travelling offshore to exploit children in Southeast Asia, but also pedophiles and their activity and their networks in our country as well. Mr Speaker, we're also worried, obviously, about the distribution of drugs such as ice. Worried about particularly regional communities where ice has infiltrated its way into many families, destroyed countless families right across the country. And, Mr Speaker, it takes investment and determination from a government to make sure that we are on the side of Australians when it comes to these very important issues. We have provided record funding not only to the Australian Federal Police but to the other agencies within the Home Affairs portfolio, including the ACIC, as well as ASIO and AUSTRAC and other organisations within this department. Mr Speaker, in addition to that, I've cancelled the visas now of almost 4,000 criminals in our country who have been involved in the sorts of criminal activities I've just detailed, destroying the lives of families, involved in the distribution of drugs, outlaw motorcycle gang members among them. And, Mr Speaker, the Labor Party would have you believe that they stand for and that they would behave in a way that we have in relation to these decisions if they were in government. But, Mr Speaker, nothing is further from the truth, because when they were last in government, we know that, for instance, they took $128 million from the AFP between 2010, 2011 and 2013-14 financial years, $30 million and 88 staff from the Australian Crime Commission between 07-8 and 13-14, $27 million and 56 staff from AUSTRAC between 2009-10 and 2013-14, and $735 million and 700 staff from Customs, resulting in a 25% reduction in sea cargo screening and a 75% reduction in air cargo screening. Mr Speaker, they did this because they ran out of money. They can't talk about education funding, they can't talk about border protection, they can't talk about dealing with transnational crime because they can't afford to pay for it. So they can promise whatever they like, Mr Speaker, as they always do in opposition, but we know that when Labor gets into government, they can never deliver on it.
The member for Hunter.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. On Saturday, the Prime Minister confirmed the agriculture worker visa is dead. But today, the former leader of the Nationals said of the same visa, and I quote, "There is no such thing as dead in politics." Close quotes. Prime Minister, is the visa dead, or is the former leader of the Nationals, or indeed leadership, hopeful, correct when he says there is no such thing as dead in politics?
Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. The member for Hunter does a pretty good impersonation of the Walking Dead in politics, Mr Speaker. He's been languishing over there for I don't know how long.
He's like the zombie savior.
He's tougher than he looks. He's tougher than you. He's tougher than he looks. He's tougher than he looks. Mr Speaker, the seriousness of the question goes to this issue. And the challenge facing Australia at the moment as we go into the half-season is to ensure that we have the workers on farm, in the orchards, whether it's in hydroponic areas or horticulturalists or wherever it needs to be, that we have the workers there to actually work with the farm producers to ensure we get the fruit off the vine and we can get it produced and we can get it to market or we can get it offshore. That's the challenge that the government is currently facing. That is the challenge that the Minister for Agriculture has brought to the government, working together with colleagues across the cabinet. And the plan that I outlined on the weekend was fairly straightforward. A, advise where the jobs are, when they're available, what they're being paid and for how long they're there. Now, that is a very important piece of information because what we don't want to see, and I would hope the Labor Party wouldn't want to see that, they wouldn't want to be seeing foreign workers or others being exploited on farms through cash payments or illegal working arrangements. I'm sure the Labor Party would not want to support those sorts of arrangements. I'm sure they would want to support a proper process where we can work out where the farm labour need is. And where there is a job in Australia, our view is an Australian should do that job where an Australian is available and fit and ready to do that job, and where an Australian is fit and ready to do that job, and if they receive an offer to do that job and they walk away, they shouldn't be getting the dole, Mr Speaker. That's what we think. Now, where there are genuine shortages in particular areas, on particular farms, we will ensure that we match those jobs up with other workers who can come through the Working Holiday Maker Visa program or the Seasonal Worker program or the Pacific Island Labour program, and we will meet that need. Now, longer-term issues around the types of visas which the member has referred to, absolutely. The government has made no decision about not having such a visa in the future. But what we need to do right now is ensure that we get those workers onto the farms to ensure the farmers have the workers that they need. But Australian jobs should go to Australian workers first, and we need to ensure that all those who are working on farms have the appropriate protections, are paid properly, and we're not having illegal workers working on our farms in Australia.
The member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Health. Will the Minister update the House on how the government is supporting the mental health of young Australians, including many in my electorate of Boothby, through Headspace centres? How does running a strong economy and sound budget management ensure these measures are not placed at risk?
The Minister for Health has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Boothby, in particular for her advocacy for endometriosis, along with many members of this House, but as well as that for her support for youth mental health and for Headspace. She's been accompanied by people on all sides, the member for Chisholm, the member for Franklin. In my first conversation with Dave Sharma, he raised Headspace and youth mental health. But this is something which is supported by people on all sides. And as she says, it is critical that we have a strong economy in order to deliver these services, which is how we've been able to deliver a $5 billion increase in Medicare funding this year, a $30 billion increase in funding for hospitals, and of course continue to list new medicines. One of the absolutely critical things that we've been able to do, though, is to support more funding for Headspace. Only yesterday, the Prime Minister joined with the member for Boothby, the Leader of the House, who played such an important role in the establishment of Headspace, in announcing an additional $51.8 million for Headspace services. We know that 1 in 4 young Australians in any year will face a mental health challenge, and that means that this issue is of critical importance to every member of this House and to every young Australian. All of us in our electorates, in our friendship groups, in our family groups, have had to deal with the challenges of youth mental health. And so yesterday's funding extends for the 107 Headspace centres around the country that funding by $39 million. It means an additional 14,000 services a year, 56,000 services over the course of 4 years. It also provides additional capital for upgrading those facilities. But as well as that, what it also includes is $12.8 million for e-Headspace services, which means that young people, when it's the dark of the night and the moment of crisis is with them, are able to seek that help, are able to get that help, which can make the difference between tragedy or having a pathway forwards, which is why, shortly after I came into the role of Health Minister, I went with Pat McGorry. We went to Grafton, where there had been a suicide cluster. We saw the need. The member for Page set out the importance of a new Headspace for Grafton, which we've been able to deliver and which I understand has had real impact in helping that local community. So these things matter. They can literally be the difference between whether a young person is able to go forwards or faces that moment of crisis. So this announcement is about saving lives and protecting lives.
The member for Herbert.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Is the Prime Minister aware the National Farmers Federation said on Saturday industry has been calling for a dedicated agricultural visa for over 12 months now? We have been talking to the government. Evidently, they have not been listening. Has Deputy Prime Minister raised any concerns with you, Prime Minister, about the government's failure to deliver this visa?
Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'll repeat it again.
Member for Dawson will cease interjecting. The Prime Minister has the call.
Our government believes that Australian jobs should go to Australians first. That's what we believe. And we believe that where jobs are available in rural and regional areas, we must do everything we possibly can to put Australians in those jobs. And where Australians who are on welfare refuse to take those jobs, then we do not believe they should be continuing to access welfare payments when they are ready and fit and able to do that work. Now, Mr Speaker, as I just said in response to the previous question, we are moving to provide, where there is a defined shortage of labour, particularly for the upcoming harvest, we will be addressing that need with our visa program to ensure that both the Working Holiday Maker Visa Scheme and also the Pacific Labour Scheme and the Seasonal Worker Scheme will be tailored to meet those shortages. And we are very keen for the agricultural sector to work with us to identify very specifically, and we've asked the national farmers and others to assist us in this task to identify where those shortages are, and we will work together to address those shortages. In the longer term, the visa arrangements that are proposed are ones that will be considered by the government, but in the short term we need to ensure we get the fruit off the vine, and that is what we're acting to do right now.
The member for Barara.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Minister for Education. Will the Minister update the House on how the government is providing record funding to government, Catholic and independent schools, including in my electorate of Barara? What are the risks and what is at stake if this commitment to providing choice in education is put at risk?
The Minister for Education has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for his question because he knows how important education is to his electorate. And he also knows that the government is providing record funding for state schools, record funding for Catholic schools and record funding for independent schools. As a matter of fact, the government is providing a record $309.6 billion investment in recurrent funding to all Australian schools from 2018 to 2029. The government's spending is growing fastest for state schools at 6.3% per student each year from 2019 to 2023, compared to per-student growth of 5.1% for the non-government sector. Importantly, this is real needs-based funding. It will mean students that need the most support will get the most support. Our focus on this side of the chamber is now turning to results, to outcomes. Money is only the means for us to achieve our goal, and our goal is for every Australian child to have an education that teaches them deep subject knowledge, essential literacy and numeracy skills, and gives them the ability to achieve their potential. That is why our government is working with state and territory governments to deliver the reforms that will improve education outcomes. At the recent Education Council, it was agreed to progress the National School Reform Agreement. This will deliver reforms in areas where national collaboration will have the greatest impact and builds on the current national reforms. This includes the creation of a unique student identifier that will allow students, parents and teachers to view lifelong progress in education. This reform will provide an incredible resource for the whole education sector to identify problems and opportunities. Learning progressions will provide support for teachers to teach the curriculum in a way that best suits individual students. So every child will get a year's worth of learning for every year in education. Now, I'm asked what are the risks to this approach, and we all know what the risk to this approach is. $200 billion in taxes that those opposite want to put on the Australian economy, which will strangle the Australian economy, which will strangle jobs growth, which will strangle receipts into the Treasury, which means that those opposite will not be able to afford to pay for the education that our students so desperately need.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper. And on indulgence, Mr Speaker, can I issue, on behalf of all of the House, a very warm welcome to the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. It's tremendous to have Prince Harry and Meghan here, and we hope they have a very pleasant stay in Australia. And can we also commend them on the reason for why they are here, and that is for the Invictus Games. And we welcome all of those athletes from coming to the Invictus Games. I'm sure they'll have an absolutely tremendous time here in Australia, and I want to particularly commend Prince Harry for his tremendous initiative in lifting the spirits of every single serviceman and woman all around the globe.
The Leader of the Opposition on indulgence.
I join with the Prime Minister in welcoming our visitors. I should also acknowledge in particular the Invictus Games. The Invictus Games are a marvellous development, and Prince Harry should be congratulated. Our Australian team will be competing. They will do very well, and their stories of effort and struggle are completely outstanding. They make us all a bit more proud to be Australian. Congratulations.
Pursuant to Section 65 of the